A warm welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to our session on what are the opportunities and challenges of using green and gray infrastructure to increase flood resilience. My name is Francisco Yanni, and I'm part of the IFRC's Climate Resilience and Migration team as a senior officer in flood resilience. And I'll be one of your moderators for today's session alongside my colleague Nini. Next slide, please. So what you see before us is our agenda. Essentially, we have it blocked out into three main areas. In the first part, we will have presentations from Anita and from Michael. Those presentations will be followed by question and answer and discussions. The second section will focus on presentations from Colin and from Brenda. And similarly, we'll have space and time for discussions and to address key questions and answers. And we really encourage you, as you hear the presentations from the speakers, to make use of the chat box to post your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them in the allotted time. And lastly, the third section will focus on an interactive exercise. So approximately 20 to 25 minutes to really break out into small groups and really allow this interactive exercise to take place. Next slide, please. In terms of the objectives of today's session, we want to support gaining a better understanding of what hybrid and green infrastructure options are available for addressing climate-related floods. We want to focus on identifying the opportunities of green and hybrid infrastructure. We want to identify the challenges and limitations for green infrastructure, and also potentials for partnerships and collaboration on nature-based solutions for flood resilience in disaster management contexts. With that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Nini, who's going to lead us through our first exercise. Over to you, Nini.
Thanks so much, Francisco, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Next slide, please. We'd like to just ask participants, when you hear about the word green and grey infrastructure for flood resilience, what is most important for you in that topic right now? Why were you interested in joining this event? And if you could please put your answers in the chat. So we're starting to see some answers coming in. Got an answer from Moshumi saying, I'd like to know more about the trade-offs. And I imagine that's the trade-offs of both green and grey infrastructure. What are some of the low-hanging fruit? What is the easiest to share and to implement? Very interesting question. So if we're looking at green infrastructure, what might be some of the easier solutions to start implementing? We also have both are likely needed. What are some of the pros and cons? Interesting point. So grey infrastructure may not be best suited when we're facing climate change. So how is green infrastructure relevant specifically in the climate change concept? And wanted to learn, right, what is green infrastructure? What is that actually about? What does that definition mean? And indeed, how do we combine? So I think a lot of questions, how do we combine the green and the grey? What are the pros and the cons? Which are the low-hanging fruit in both? And what's the buy-in from actors? Interesting, what's the way, do we make both green and grey infrastructure appealing? Do we need to do some shifts from traditional infrastructure? How do we change mindsets? Super, so there's a few questions to get us started. I'd like to pass over to you, Francisco, to present our speakers and get going. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Nini. So I want to introduce our first speaker, Anita Van Breda, who is a Senior Director of Environment and Disaster Management at World Wildlife Fund in Washington, D.C. She leads WWF's work supporting environmentally responsible disaster recovery, reconstruction, and risk reduction, including international policy, operations, and training. Welcome, Anita. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting us to participate in this event today. I'm delighted to be here and to join some old friends and make some new friends amongst this group. And already the questions that were shared in the chat already have me inspired for this discussion. So thank you for that. I am going to talk about two of my favorite subjects, nature and floods and flooding. I didn't think I would get so interested in floods. When we started this program in 2015, we were asked by the U.S. Agency of International Development, Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs, to write a guidebook on how to use natural and nature-based approaches to flood management. So we finished that guidebook and launched it in 2017. And then we started the development of a training program to support the use of the guidebook, which we launched in 2020, shortly before the pandemic. So all our plans to do training around the world with groups such as yours, of course, like everyone else, we had to pivot to doing fully online and virtual trainings. And we've been doing that since 2020, reaching several hundred people by now in that process. But we do look forward to getting back to working in person on the ground with folks like yourself. So I'm just going to ask for the next slide, where we will see just a very short video that explains the approach in our Flood Green Guide project. Thank you.
Communities all across the globe are affected by floods. Communities of every size, shape, and location. And these floods happen in your community's watershed. An amazing system of physical, ecological, and social components that are constantly working together across floodplain, community, and household scales. And while floods often pose serious problems to residents, to infrastructure, and to local economies, floods can also be a natural process and can play an important role in a community. For example, by depositing nutrients necessary for agriculture. That's why it's critical to understand what contributes to flood risk, how to minimize potential damage, and how to maximize potential benefits of floodwaters. The new Natural and Nature-Based Flood Management, a Green Guide, presents flood risk management as a comprehensive approach, explaining how nature-based techniques can help reduce risk and provide community benefits while complementing engineering options. For example, some communities might benefit from a combination of upstream reforestation and small dams to retain water, and the creation of green roofs for water absorption in downstream urban areas, while another community might get more benefit from a combination of wetland restoration and improving engineered drainage systems. The key is to find the right combination of options to meet your specific challenges, while being flexible enough to allow for future changes, such as changes in land use or climate, and ultimately making your community stronger, safer, and more resilient. That's Green Flood Management, innovative guidance that provides forward-looking, practical, natural, and nature-based options for communities all across the world. No matter where you live. To find out more, visit www.envirodm.org.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So these are the principles that we based our program on. I'm not going to go through them all, but just to say that we really recommend taking an integrated flood risk management, or IFRM, approach and understanding where you are in the watershed in order to understand risk and to understand what combination of methods might be appropriate for that risk. And in understanding the watershed, we think it's important to understand that a watershed is more than just a biophysical place. There are also important political, economic, and social factors within that watershed, which have a significant bearing on how successful any combination of flood management approaches might be. Next slide. So as we say in the video, not all flooding is bad. And so our perspective is not to try to stop all floods in every situation, but to understand what benefits floods, which could be a natural process in some landscapes, what benefits do they provide to communities, and how can we maximize the benefits by minimizing or eliminating the negative impacts of floods, obviously loss of life and damage to infrastructure. Next slide. So it's important to avoid the temptation to jump into doing methods, but to really stop and have a look at where you are in the watershed and really understand the risk perspective in that watershed, what's happening upstream from where you are, what's happening downstream, and how to make decisions that will have a bearing over time. So understanding what risk is not something that's a static one-off process, but it's a continual process, and we adjust flood risk management methods accordingly. Next slide. So in our program, we focus on 29 different methods. These are not the only methods available, but these are the ones that we focused on in our program. And they're organized based on the non-structural methods, which are primarily policy and behavior changes, and then structural, which include the soft or green infrastructure and the hard or gray infrastructure. And the reason why we included hard or gray infrastructure in our program is to recognize that in many places there already is gray or hard engineering in place. And in many instances, a combination of green and gray will be required. So we wanted to factor that into the guidebook and the training program. Next slide. We also recognize that you're going to be working at different scales, and different combinations of methods will work at different scales. So oftentimes with green infrastructure, there can be an emphasis on the landscape level scale for nature-based approaches, which makes sense and is often appropriate. But we believe that the nature-based approaches can be used at multiple scales, and they are going to work differently depending on the scale and depending on the context and depending on the risk. So it's important to not only understand what is your risk profile, but what is the objective for the flood management combination of methods, and then going through a deliberate process of understanding the design considerations for any number of methods and how they might work together in particular locations at different scales. Next slide. Next slide. So our approach is to first promote the non-structural or the policy or behavior changes approaches. If that is not sufficient, then add the green or the soft infrastructure. And then last and hopefully least, if needed, include the hard or the gray infrastructure. So again, it's a hierarchy of choices from the non-structural policy-oriented to the combination with soft or green. And then last and hopefully least, if necessary, the hard engineering methods. Next slide. So it's important to also look at optimizing by combining. So as the video explained and this illustration reinforces, if, for example, there is a dam and a reservoir, if you hit next, there's some animation with this slide. The water will flow right from the upper part of the watershed to the lower part. So if we can look upstream and work with neighboring communities, for example, to reforest the headwaters of the flood, from the flood waters, maybe revegetate slopes, regreen the waterways, and we look downstream and work with neighbors in the downstream area to restore or manage wetlands, to keep livestock, for example, out of the waterways. If we do those things in combination, if you hit next, then the amount of hard or gray engineering is minimized. And that's why we're always looking to try to combine so that we can, next animation, so that we can support the co-benefits that using the green infrastructure can provide and minimize the gray infrastructure in that approach. Next slide. So some challenges and opportunities. One thing that's become quite obvious in our training program is, again, there's a naturally an understood approach to want to jump to doing methods. But again, we want to encourage people to stop and do a proper risk assessment and then set specific objectives for the flood management methods. Another challenge in using green infrastructure is the segregation of disciplines and agencies responsible for flood management. So we're all segregated in our silos, but for green and gray to work and to work together, we need to be better at collaborating and to make a deliberate approach at collaborating across agencies and with partners from different agencies. The scale question I already touched on, but your agency, your situation may not have authority or decision-making in a scale or scope that's going to be appropriate for your objective. So that's just to suggest that that be taken on board and taken into consideration when choosing a combination of methods. Fourth, there's a lack of awareness of these green approaches. There's a lack of awareness of the ability to combine them. There can be challenges around code and zoning to meet certain requirements for flood risk management. So there's more that needs to be done to demonstrate the efficacy of these approaches and to weave that into policy approaches at multiple levels. In much of this work, there are resource limitations, both in time and money and expertise. So again, I think there are great opportunities to look for synergies with other actors and other partners. And then the sixth challenge we face, of course, is uncertainty. We know that climate change changes everything, but there are other uncertainties as well. What is going to happen at a political situation within the watershed? How are land use decisions made? Where and how might people move or relocate? All of that will have a bearing on flood risk and will have a bearing on which combination of flood risk management methods are appropriate and how well they function. So we need to embrace multiple kinds of uncertainty and also remember that nature itself will need to adapt. So as we're using more green infrastructure, are we allowing for the adaptation that that green infrastructure itself might need to experience in order to continue to function the way we need it to? Next slide. So there are a lot of partnering opportunities, and there's a lot of partnerships that have happened in the past and that are ongoing now. I've had the good fortune to partner with a lot of agencies that are speaking today. So I think we need to be more deliberate and build upon that type of work. I think there are opportunities, for example, for co-location of staff to get to know each other a little bit better, establish trust if we're going to work together on these types of issues. I think there's also opportunities to do more training together and to co-generate that type of training. And then I would say, thirdly, there's a real need for more community engagement and for different kinds of community engagement and storytelling. So I think there's more possibilities around partnering in the future on those issues in terms of flood management. Next slide. And with that, I will thank you for your time and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights, Anita, and for highlighting how green infrastructure is multifunctional and operates at multiple scales. Equally, how green infrastructure performs multiple functions as an integrated concept, a delivery mechanism, and as a planning approach. With this, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Michael Zoni is a member of the executive staff in Zurich Insurance Group's sustainability function, based at Corporate Center in Switzerland. He leads Zurich's award-winning flood resilience program, a multi-sector alliance with academia, humanitarian organizations, and the private sector, aiming to enhance community flood resilience. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Francisco. And my input is not so much a presentation, but rather, 5 key points to take away, or, food for thought, or 5 key messages as I have phrased them. So let me start with 1. So the move to nature positive activities and values are really essential, not only But certainly for achieving the climate goals, there's many other approaches where this can benefit as well. There's biodiversity objectives, there's other sustainability objectives, but I think the value for the climate goals are obvious. They will also be good business, and that's why the private sector really must take an active role from two perspectives. Actively working with and developing nature-based solutions. So for that, I'm particularly looking at the construction and engineering industries because they will be developing and implementing the solutions. And B, we need to accept and value these solutions that they perform, that they are adequate solutions, and that they can be accepted for whatever assessment we need to do. And in particular, I'm thinking, insurance and finance in terms of protection level and associated insurance contracts, as well as banking, mortgages, investing, etc. So that's why the private sector has a role. Second, grey infrastructure still is, to a large extent, the traditional and well-established approach. And green is seen as new and to some extent as more risky and exploratory. However, today there's a lot of dynamic that I'm really positive to see to move to green, including also from the business sector itself. So recent dynamics include adding the TNFD, so the Task Force on Nature Financial Disclosures, in addition to the well-known TCFD, so the Task Force for the Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So they are almost having this new parallel of adding nature-based to this stream. And the very active role that the UN PSI initiative, so the Principles for Sustainable Insurance at the UN level, are playing. So there's some good move to mainstream green, and these initiatives are really good stepping stones. 3, to achieve this mainstream, we need good examples. We need solutions that work successfully, that are financially sound, and that function reliably. They need to come from the local level. So by the way, I really talk a lot recently about the principles for local level adaptation. I'm really glad we signed up to that. But it has to come bottom up, and we need then to be able to scale up these solutions to make them business as usual. So this relates back to the reliability part. How do we find reliable solutions, and how do we prove that they outperform the grey solutions? I think one challenge is the time element. And the second is a sort of a mindset element. The grey you see immediately, and you have the mayor who can cut the ribbon and say, we've built this wall and it will protect you. Whereas with green, it may take time for it to be fully established. Let's think of a restored reef or a mangrove coastline. And once fully performing, it may actually not be that obvious. So these are some of the challenges that we need to take into account when making these solutions work and make them mainstream. So what do we do then to achieve that mainstreaming? So that's 4. We know anecdotally what NBS can do, but we need more, and we need better evidence, really robust data. And Anita has really said it well already. So science needs to help us to gain rock solid proof points and the necessary evidence that green, in terms of reliability and functional performance, is just as reliable as the traditionally engineered, and that they have better cost-benefit ratios, and that they have these additional co-benefits, also, as Anita was saying. And believe me, I'm really happy to see these synergies, but we did not rehearse this. So really glad to see that. So 5, the last point then. How do we get the evidence to make green solutions perform even better? Well, I think we need to change the way costs and benefits are calculated. We need better counting what is good and what is green. So a slightly adjusted understanding of what is benefit and what is cost. There are so many co-benefits that are really hard to quantify. So we need to bring in some elements of, people's targets, better quality of life targets, reduced health impacts. If we can better quantify these as benefits, and on the other hand, if we can improve what costs are in terms of indirect unintended consequences from grey infrastructure, I think we get a better level playing field so that grey and green are better compared to each other. And that definitely will help us with this approach and support climate change adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that. And I really like it how you were saying there are some similar opportunities and challenges of both you and Anita were highlighting, although this was a non-coordinated input. And really interesting, of course, hearing your point of view coming from the private sector as well, and how you visualize some of these points. If we could get the next slide, please, we'd really like to, no, sorry, just the previous one. If there are any questions, from the audience, if you could please put them in the chat, and we'd put those to Anita and Michael. So first question is coming through: how can decision makers and politicians that think in terms of short cycles, how can they be convinced of green infrastructure that will show impacts only in the longer run? So this temporal element that you raised as well, Michael, in your points. I don't know, Anita or Michael, would either of you be interested in taking on board that point? How do you convince decision makers on green infrastructures, especially taking the time element? And I don't know, Anita, maybe if you also have some practical examples from your experience.
Yeah, I think this comes up quite a bit. And I think, in my own country here in the US, there are plenty of examples of failures of gray infrastructure. So that's not often hard to point to, but I have also had, for example, I had a mayor of a municipality along the Mississippi River watershed call me once and say, look, we have green infrastructure in our place. We like it. We want more of it, but we just had a flood, and our congressperson has assured us they're going to get us money to rebuild from the floods. And they have pegged it all to see, dikes and levees. And we don't want that. We want the green infrastructure. So how can you help me convince my congressperson that that's what we want? And this is what people are facing. So a lot of times, as Michael said, it has to come from the bottom up, and it has to be locally driven. And that's why we are focusing more on our work, working with international communities on storytelling and advocacy and engagement at the local level, so that they can be there to present alternative views. But also, as Michael mentioned, the private sector is important because there are often limitations on what local contractors will offer and be willing to consider. So that can often stop or hold back some kind of innovation if you don't have the private sector ready, willing, and able to support using green infrastructure. So it is changing mindsets, and it is what we're trying to do is to get those different mindsets and decision-making people in the same room, to bring in some local level government, as well as some engineers and some community activists to look together at this issue so that they start to think a little bit more creatively.
Super, thank you, Anita. Michael, is there anything you would like to add? And maybe even, say as a private sector representative, what might be some of the issues? What would make the case convincing for you? What would be the type of data or science that you mentioned that would convince you that this is something that is worth ensuring, that is worth investing in?
Sure. And I think it's obviously a loaded but very important question. And I need to also switch hats a little bit with my alliance role. Obviously, while I come from the private sector, I don't necessarily always speak with that typical private sector voice. So first of all, directly in response to the question, I think, the answer is in the question in terms of we need to align cycles of what success looks like with the cycles in which change is happening and in which, outcomes are measured. So I'm not saying, we need to elect politicians for 50 years instead of 5 years. That might be a different challenge altogether. But I think it has to go into, how do you measure success that a politician contributes to? And that already starts, with this, discounting challenge that always prefers the present and the near future over the long-term future. So there's many kind of, false incentives or disincentives in our current system that we need to break through. And it's probably also a bit of a stretch to say, well, maybe you need to go 10, 15 years back to a politician back when and, check what have they actually done in their term to contribute to that long-term solution. But I think some creative thinking in that direction is needed. In terms of the private sector, I mean, what we see emerging more and more also from the whole climate change debate is that sustainability is a good business, and that we are starting to think much more longer term to ensure we do have a viable businesses in the far away future as well. And one of the biggest obstacles there again are false incentives and are, you know, unlevel playing fields. So if it's cheaper for me to build gray rather than green, if it's cheaper for me to pollute now and maybe or not repair later, then in the short term, I am advantaged over those that take a short-term hit to invest in the longer term. And obviously those investors that only look for this short-term piece, they would go there. So we need to eliminate that. In the risk and adaptation space, I don't know what the perfect equivalent would be, but it would need to be the equivalent of a price of carbon. You know, in the climate mitigation space, it's very clear. If we have a fair price on carbon, then the short-term thinking of polluting first slowly will go away. Again, it's a bit of a stretch. I have this concept of, you know, a risk budget in mind. So every country, every, you know, environment, and therefore every politician has a risk budget. If that's exhausted, you can't build a new house in the floodplain. You can't build something that is adding to that risk unless you mitigate it elsewhere and you're using the appropriate technologies. But just throwing that out there, you know, the idea of a risk budget where you need to cap.
Super, thank you so much, Michael, and fascinating, really, really interesting to hear your views on that. And I like that idea of a risk budget. Conversation to be continued. Excellent. If we could get the next slide. So we get a thank you for the very interesting answers, indeed, both extremely interesting answers. If any of the participants would like to share, have you been working on flood resilience in your country or community, either on nature-based green infrastructure or grey infrastructure? If anyone wants to share any of their experiences, please put it in the chat. And as we're running a bit behind time, I'll pass over simultaneously to Francisco to present the next speaker, please.
Thanks so much, Nini, and thanks again, Anita and Michael, for your great insights. It's a pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Colin McQuiston, who is head of climate and resilience at Practical Action. He works at global and country levels to explore critical advocacy and knowledge generation needs that will lead to the changes necessary to reduce the risk of poor and vulnerable communities around the world. Colin, the floor is yours.
Colin, we can't hear you at the moment. I'm wondering, should we jump to Brenda and then come back to Colin? I know Colin is actually joining us from COP, so he might have some connectivity issues. I think, Sayanika, if we could jump over Brenda, would you be ready to present now?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Perfect.
Sorry, Brenda, before you get going, let me introduce you. So thanks for being ready. So it's a pleasure, thanks again, Brenda, to introduce Brenda Avila Flores, who is the Community Resilience Program Coordinator for the Mexican Red Cross, and has a PhD in Educational Research, Environmental Education for Sustainability. She has worked on environmental education and climate change issues for both government organizations and institutions. Brenda, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about the next one, please. Where is the title of the presentation? I'm going to talk about the natural-based solutions, but at community level. And in fact, to answer the last questions that you have done in this forum, but at community level, we haven't done any particular to work with the communities related to natural-based solutions. But without a doubt, we have identified many opportunity areas from the academy, from stakeholders. So it's very interesting how we can establish some areas to work with the communities, because that's the role that we have done as a Red Cross movement, to work with the communities. So next one, please. So a little introduction. Well, the mitigation of the impacts of floods has been based mainly on the construction and infrastructure to protect the human settlements, but also mainly the productive sector in Mexico, including all extraction infrastructure, as well as the livestock and agricultural industry. That's where the main actions has been taken in the state of Tabasco. It's a very specific case in Mexico. In Tabasco specifically, since the 1950s, several infrastructure works have been built to protect or mitigate the impact of floods, such that as some of them is listed in the presentation: construction of dams, river channels has been modified. It has been done soil adaptation to control crop irrigation, and many small scale works by different productive companies. And I write down some of the many activities related to great infrastructure that have been done in Tabasco. And I can continue list, but it's at the risk of this, they don't belong to a comprehensive flood control plan, and they can have, or they have, repercussions when a significant hydrometeorological event occurs. Next one, please. Well, however, it has been developed some studies that have been carried out at the regional level, and which reveal that the hydrological works are not the only option for mitigating the impact of floods of Tabasco. And one of the most recent is one conducted by the Norwegian Red Cross and the Climate Center, related on the impact of the climate change in coastal zone. And this study is brand new, highlights the main vulnerabilities and exposure, and highlights some areas of opportunity to strengthen adaptation and mitigation through the natural-based solutions. So I can list some of them, but I'm going to remark again in the next slide, but before pass the next slide, is how the opportunities are well identified and the needs are very well highlighted by the academy, or even for the political or governmental institutions. Next one, please. So I'm going to say this. Well, we have a list of recommendations. We have seen some with Anita and some challenge that she has listed, but now taking the last I write down in the previous slide, I wonder what a community can do. So in green, I highlight maybe the opportunities that we can work with together with the communities, and restoration of an ecological regeneration process, protection of coastal dunes, mangroves and coastal vegetation, protecting nature by building ecosystems, and return the old practice of native people. I think this is very related to the daily life of the communities, and if there is not, if it is not related to the daily life of the communities, it's very hard to work together with the community, I think. And in red, I highlight this one because it's a recommendation that it's very strong, but it's very hard to work with the community because it implies cultural and habits that it's very hard to change. So we have to start to think that the natural-based solutions haven't permeated the community level. Unfortunately, in Mexico, they are still on an environmental agenda, but it's missing to connect these solutions with the regulations or political frameworks, and most important, to connect with the people that is affected by phenomena. And it's very important to rescue all the practice that it has been developed by another institutions and figure out how can we work together with the communities to understand the risk. Also, I would like to add the challenge number 7 from the list from Anita, and this is the challenge of change the habits of the cultural habits, because it's very hard to change the minds of many of the communities that depends of the resources exploitation. Thank you, and the last one is my email for any question additional. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, Brenda, and both Nini and I are taking a lot of notes as we hear great insights from all the speakers. And thank you for putting this great emphasis on the role culture plays in nature-based solutions and in the topic of today, and also this idea of greater community engagement and co-design of projects, and how critical this is for both the short-term and long-term sustainability of anything we do. With this, I'd like to see if my dear colleague, Colin, if you are back and if you could hear us. Colin?
Hi there. Can you see? Can you hear me?
Cheers and welcome back. We know you're at COP, so over to you, Colin.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Francisco, for the introduction. It's really good to be here. Yeah, as Francisco says, I'm at the COP at the moment, yeah, it's pretty hectic here. But nature-based solutions are definitely one aspect of the discussions that is very important here in Glasgow. So yeah, I'm Colin McQuiston. I'm head of climate resilience at Practical Action, and Practical Action has been another of the partner organisations with Zurich and with the IFRC in the Flood Resilience Alliance. Next slide, please. So Practical Action has been working for over 50 years. We're a development organisation. We work primarily in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. And we work in agriculture, energy, urban waste management and essential services, and in resilience, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation. And in the work that we do under Resilience That Protect, which is this broad framing, I'm going to talk about our work in Nepal, where we have the longest standing engagement with communities on the ground, and some of the best experiences of where nature-based solutions and hard infrastructure demonstrate the strengths and the weaknesses of the green and grey approaches. So if you go to the next slide, please. So several of the speakers have already talked about integrating nature-based solutions into formal planning processes. And one of the issues that we realized very early on in our work in Nepal was that the language of the community, the language of the local government, and the language of the central government were often not the same. It wasn't that they were conflicting, but they were articulating things in different ways. And unless a community could get a biodiversity expert or an engineering expert to come into the community and help them to articulate what project or program they would like to see in those in that scientific language, in a way that is framed to look more acceptable, then local governments and particularly national governments were not listening to them. So we're really pleased to have been one of the members who developed this flood resilience measurement framework. And I'm really sorry if Brenda or talked about this in her slide presentation as I dropped out of the call. But the great thing about the flood resilience measurement framework is it's a framework that enables a community with a civil society NGO partner to do quite a comprehensive assessment of the community at that moment in time. And it is built around the 5 capitals of the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, and then linked to a resilience framing. And the great thing about the tool is it removes the need for the technical experts to a degree. So the community can do an assessment of their financial resources without really having to require an economist or a financial capital specialist to come in. They can do a quick analysis of the natural capital in their community without having ecosystems, biodiversity, ecologists come in and help them do that. And this, I think, is one of the most important values of the flood resilience measurement framework, is it removes that need for external technical expertise and enables a community to engage in a holistic planning process that they can then use to articulate with local governments and central governments. Next slide, please. So in Nepal, there are a number of challenges around the role of nature-based solutions and how to mainstream them more into standard practice. And nature-based solutions in Nepal are quite well recognized. Nepal has a long-standing history of community forestry. And community forestry is a nature-based approach to development. And therefore, there is already a degree of resonance at the local level to promote nature-based solutions. But in the context that we're working in Nepal, in the Terai, where the rivers from the Himalayas rush into the flatlands and start to meander and create flood zones. These nature-based solutions could be of multiple different types. We could have nature-based solutions that prevent a flood event happening, such as a barrier, some sort of barrier structure, maybe a dike that's got community forestry on it. But equally, the nature-based solutions could be more of a coping strategy, so that when the flood actually occurs, the wetland on the periphery of the village, because the community can no longer access the market, they can use that wetland for fish, for fishing and collecting products. So the way the nature-based solutions are manifest in these communities in Nepal is multiple. But also, when you go into the communities and you talk about, well, what are the things that they could do to build their resilience, they automatically tend to gravitate towards the hard infrastructure solutions. Michael was certainly talking about this in his presentation, where political leaders and local government officials want to be seen to be doing something, and to be seen to be doing something means you need to pour lots of concrete. But, and we've already had several speakers talk about this, if you can implement these nature-based solutions and generate the evidence and demonstrate that they work, then of course you can overcome some of those barriers. So next slide, please. So in Nepal, we have been working on looking at a suite of nature-based solutions in these communities. And in each of the communities, we've used the flood resilience measurement framework to identify what those nature-based solutions may look like. And then we have introduced those ideas into the local governance system. And that starts very much at the community level. And there is a photograph of a community meeting at which they are discussing, evaluating, and deciding what are the propositions that they want to take to the local government. And they're looking at enhanced wetlands, they're looking at construction of dikes between the community and the river, they're looking at maybe restoration of seasonal channels in the landscape, they're looking at restoration of plants and vegetation in various components of the landscape. And what they need to do is they need to come up with a plan that they can then introduce to the next level of government. And it's really important to sequence the community's engagement with the local planning process, with the ideas that they want to implement at the right moments in time. And this feeds up through the levels of local government up to the provincial level where the money rests. And then once those plans get agreed, then the money can flow down to the relevant level and then be implemented. And next slide, please. So in Nepal, we've done this process. We're operating in 40 communities. We've done the FRMC, the Flood Resilience Measurement Framework analysis. We've developed community development, community resilience plans. We've worked with local institutions, and we're now starting to roll out those plans. And these are just some of the examples of some of the initiatives that those plans have developed. First of all, community forests. As I said earlier, community forests are very, very important in Nepal. There are great nature-based solutions, and in many of the areas where we're working, they're primarily of two types of functions. There's the function that Anita mentioned at the beginning, which is the watershed restoration and protection function, to increase infiltration higher up the slope so that less of it is cascading down and causing disastrous flood events in communities. The second function is closer to the community itself, and it's the use of community forestry as a barrier between the flood pulse, the flood wave, and the community itself. And many of these communities, the houses are made of mud and bamboo, and they're quite robust, but not when they get wet. So it's really important to reduce the level of water that percolates into the community to protect their houses. The photograph on the right is of a biodike, and this is an excellent example of a combination of a grey and a green infrastructure. It's a raised dike or levee of soil and material that's piled up on the riverbank. It's held together with bamboo poles and bamboo stakes at various levels to hold the material together. And in places where there is maybe the risk of erosion, using large boulders to protect the toe of the dike itself. But the important thing about the biodike is that it's planted up with vegetation. So use grasses with long roots, use bamboo, use rattan, things that can connect and build the rigidity of that structure. Also trees, the roots of the trees will mature, develop a much more coherent structure. And the great thing about the combination of the grey and the green in the biodikes is one of the aspects of grey infrastructure is it's not maintained, it's not monitored, it's not maintained, and therefore it erodes its resilience, its ability to withstand the flood erodes over time until a catastrophic failure. We know many examples around the world where an engineered structure has not been maintained sufficiently, has failed, and we've had a devastating flood. The great thing about these biodikes is the living component actually provides a degree of maintenance to the structure. But secondly, because many of those plants and products are useful to the community, they're visiting the biodikes regularly, they're harvesting the grass for the fodder for their cows, they're harvesting the bamboo, they're harvesting the fruit, and they're seeing areas where erosion is taking place. And because it's using locally available materials, the biodike can be restored by the community. Finally, on the bottom right-hand side, we're now looking at larger scale activities that connect numerous communities. One of those is particularly around restoration of wetlands in the landscape. Many of those wetlands are seasonal. So if you go there in the summer, there is no water, but in the winter, when the rains are falling, these areas fill up with water. So working with the communities to restore these wetlands so that they act as a storage for flood water when the flooding season occurs. We're also looking at ideas where the economic value of the biodiversity can actually help the communities with livelihood initiatives. So tree planting with commercially viable tree crops, community forestry with a high proportion of herbal crops that can generate local livelihood activities. But these are activities that we're in the process now of developing and designing and hoping to implement. So next slide, please. Finally, a huge thanks to my colleague, Bikram Rana, who is the project manager for the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance program in Nepal. This is his presentation. He would, ideally, under ideal circumstances, he would have been the person on the DNC Days presentation today, giving it. It's been a great pleasure to share his experience with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin, for that. It was really interesting, and I really enjoyed those very practical examples. What does this look like on the ground, and what are the implications and how you go through that process at community level? Extremely interesting. Just to see, are there any questions for Colin or Brenda? I personally actually wanted to ask you, Colin, when you're down at community level, how do you choose which option you go for? What's the kind of information and process you use for choosing, you know, biodikes over or together with community forestry? What's the community level process on that? And another question I had was, how do you merge that? That was really interesting how you showed that decision-making level. When you get up to, like, say, the Palika stage, how does that, if that's different to the watershed structure? Because I know that's often a question that comes up with NBS, when ideally we'd be doing governance arrangements around a watershed, but sometimes the institutional arrangements are different. So those would be a couple of questions.
Thank you, Nini. On the selection of the options, there really are two dimensions that the community needs to think about. And again, this flood resilience measurement framework gives the community indications in both dimensions. The first dimension is, how does the flood impact that community? Is the flood's biggest impact on that community the power of the flood pulse as it hits the community? Or is the problem more the fact that the flood water gradually rises and the community finds itself with surface flooding that lasts maybe a week or maybe longer? So the first thing is to understand the flood typology, how the flood actually impacts that community. And then the second thing related to understanding how the flood impact is manifest is then, well, how will the natural capital, the natural solutions respond to the threat that that community is facing? So the example I gave about the community forestry, this is an idea that came up in many of the communities who are living in those erosive areas on the river. We're talking about Himalayan rivers. When the monsoon rains fall, they go from rivers that are full of water to raging torrents. And it's that pulse of water that punches its way down the river that is highly destructive. In those communities, the best option is the use of community forestry to act as a barrier. It diverts logs and other material that is carried by those destructive flood pulses, and it reduces the power of the flood pulse, so that the houses may be damaged, but they're not totally wiped away. Whereas in communities that maybe live a little bit further away from the river, or maybe live on the leeward side of the river where the deposition is occurring, then it's less about that powerful flood pulse and might be more about the fact that the water inundates the area of agriculture, or the inundation prevents the community reaching of a local market. So then they can be thinking about, well, if I can't reach the local market, how could a nature-based solution support me? Maybe vegetables or fish collected from a pond could help feed the community while they've lost the access to those local markets. So thinking about the relationship between the flood and how it's manifest and the nature-based solutions and how that would help them against that particular threat. And I'm sorry, you did ask another question, but I forgot what.
No worries about that. Was about to do with the governance. How do you deal with if the governance structures are not aligned with the watershed? So how do you bring the right stakeholders together?
Okay, well, we have actually got a very good example of that in one of the communities we're working on in Nepal. Just basically in terms of linking the evidence from the community into the national planning process, the key has been using the flood resilience measurement framework, using the outputs of that, which look quite scientific, they look quite technical, and using those with local government officials. So it's not a hand-drawn map, it's a map that's superimposed over a Google map or something. You're talking about the assessment of the restoring the seasonal wetlands versus the planting of the community forestry with data that supports the two different options. And of course, central to that is the preferences of the community, which then can be used to persuade the local government to support these initiatives. But one example, which is interesting, was a community wanted to protect itself from a flood pulse. It applied to the local government for a hard infrastructure measure, and the local government said, yeah, we've got a program of rolling out hard infrastructure in this river basin, but you're far too remote. You're in an area which isn't a major priority for us. You're going to be at the bottom of the list for the hard infrastructure. So the community went away despondent that they weren't going to get the gabions and the concrete. They went back home, and it was our local partner in Nepal who visited them and said, well, have you seen the community down the road who've got a biodike? Why don't you build a biodike? They visited that community, they saw it, they said, well, that's better than nothing, we will build a biodike. Now, they lived on the opposite bank of the river from Bardia National Park, which is a conservation area. They then had to, so they went to the local government and said, look, we'd like to build a biodike. And the local government said, well, that's only going to cost us a couple of $1,000 in investment. You're going to do all of the manpower and the labor. That's a great idea. We approve it. Oh, by the way, you better go and get the approval of the national park. They went to the national park and they asked for approval to build this biodike, and the national park said they couldn't. And the fear from the national park was a lot of wildlife come out of the national park, go into the river, and they felt that the biodike might form a barrier to them. It took a couple of discussions, taking the national park to visit other biodikes in the area before I think they misconstrued what the biodike actually was. They expected something that was much more of a physical barrier rather than something that was a natural barrier. Ultimately, we were able to persuade the national park to sign off the approval. That then released the local government funds, and the community was able to build a 250-meter long biodike that protected them in the 2020 and the 2021 floods that occurred in those areas. Thank you.
Super, thank you so much, Colin. Really, really interesting examples. Francisco, did you have a question you wanted to ask as well?
Yeah, maybe just a quick question to Brenda. And again, thanks so much, Colin and Brenda, for your insights. Brenda, in one of your slides, you put up what can a community do? And I was struck by two of the points towards the bottom. One read, protecting nature by valuing ecosystem services. And the second one was around returning to the old practices of native peoples. I'm wondering if you could, particularly the second point, these old practices, if you could stretch that a little bit and give us some more insights on what exactly do you see as an opportunity here?
Yeah, well, I think it's very related with the risk perception, because it was quite different the previous impacts of the floods with some communities. And now we can see that this risk increased because the people has more things to take care. The exposition is more for the communities, for the settlements. So people is changing the way of their lives. For example, they are adapting the new ways of life, styles of life. They acquire some goods that maybe is not related to the context where they live. So I think the simplest life maybe is better for them because the conditions, because they used to live into the water bed, but the effects were different previous and now, because now they lose a television, they lose a fridge, and before maybe they have another ways of subsistences. So their livelihoods is more exposed because they are changing the ways of life. I'm not saying that they don't have to have a television, but maybe they have to remember the place where they are living. the resources that they depend on. So I think it's very important this working in this risk perception to take into account what is the value of their environment, because they live into now the new generations used to see the floods as a regular impact. And they used to see how every year they have to change their beds, they have to change many goods, but it's something that is seen as normal. I think we have to stop that and start to realize that we don't have to lose our goods every year. And I think is where we can recover all practices to take care of the resources of the environment that people used to take care before.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Really appreciate your insights. Over to you, Nini.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Really interesting hearing from all of you. There's different perceptions and angles. And I really like this word you used of risk perceptions changing. There's a very good call for all of us to work on that at all levels, really. We'd now like to invite you into breakout rooms. If I could get the next slide, please. So you're going to be automatically taken into a breakout group just for about 10 minutes or so. And would like you in that space to share anything you'd like to share. What are your own experiences working with flood resilience, including around nature-based solutions, some of the challenges you might have had, and if for your own work, are there particular partnerships you would need to take this work further? So we've heard of some of the challenges we face. Do you think partnering with certain different types of stakeholders, whether they're, we've been talking about the importance of science or getting decision makers on board, about engaging communities, about engaging the private sector. For you personally, in your work at the moment, what kind of partnerships might be relevant for taking this work further moving forward? So Anika, I'll pass over to you. And I think we are all going to be automatically taken to the groups. So please just click the blue join button as it comes on to your screen. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We wanted to give just a brief opportunity for the groups. If you wanted to give a couple of key messages, if I could get the next slide, please. We would like to ask you 2 short sentences, key findings from your group. And I saw my dear colleague, Jen, you popped up on the screen. Jen, would you have liked to feedback from your group? Oh, I've lost Jen. Francisco or Colin, believe you were in the same group. Would you like to feedback?
Sure, please feel free to add Colin. So I was with Colin and Sam. Sam's a university student, so it's great to have her in our small group. I think 2 main things came out from Sam's perspective, studying the issue of urban planning. She really appreciated the real practical examples, and again that whole idea of theory into practice. Colin discussed how nature-based solutions don't have proven decision criteria, and how this is of incredible interest to practical action. And also he's physically a cop right now. So this idea of evidence and really understanding issues of tolerance, etc., as they relate to nature-based solutions. So really inspiring work that that is just emerging, and it could be a game changer.
Super, thank you, Francisco. If anyone else wants to add anything from that group, otherwise I'll pass over. Nina, maybe would you like to summarize some of the discussions from your group?
Yes, so we also had a really interesting conversation, heard from different projects, and yeah, I want to highlight the importance of the community engagement, getting everybody together, and also recognizing that there are different interests that we need to face, and that we have to bring these interests together and just become part of a bigger solution that everyone benefits.
Super, thank you, Nina. Okay, Jen is saying she's back and happy to share. Yes, Jen, over to you, please.
Thank you. I was with Jonathan and Anita, and we had a great conversation which talked about looking at changing mindsets about things like the psychological incentivization of people who are coming into this industry, who are promoting nature-based solutions and working that field. Anita pointed out an organization called Engineering with Nature, which looks at how to do an approach of integrated processes and building capacity. And we talked a lot about also just the idea of mainstreaming NBS in different contexts, whether they be humanitarian or other, and how to go about doing that.
Super, thanks a lot, Jen, for that summary. It sounds like an interesting conversation you had. Brenda, would you like to feedback from our group?
Yeah, we share that, what is the importance of the community, well, the challenge with the community as the culture as a main challenge to work with the communities, and how we can work together looking for and the solutions, and how to permeate the problematic with the people, because it's very different when we work with a wall plan, and when we go into communities, everything can change, and there is no a perfect plan once you get into the community. So we have to start to work with them with the risk perception to understand how they understand their own risk, and how we from then how we can reconfigure the work with them. So we have to find a moment when we can match all the studies, all the contents, all the research that it has been done in some place or in some region, and how to match when the understanding of the communities. So I think we have also a big challenge with in the program, because now we are start working in urban areas. So we have the main challenge, because we used to see the natural solutions related to rural communities, but it's maybe it's a challenge to match the natural-based solutions in urban communities. So I think we have to start to communicate with the people that the nature should, it's part of our lives. It doesn't matter if you live in a city or in a rural context.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for your remarks. Really, really appreciate it. Again, just want to extend a huge thank you to our speakers, Anita, Michael, Colin, Brenda. Thank you so much for your key insights in today's session. Thank you so much, Nini, for co-flying the plane with me, and Nina and others that are also working behind the scenes to keep this going. In terms of some high-level key takeaways, the importance of green infrastructure, and how this issue is multifunctional and operates at multiple scales. We also heard about hybrid approaches as an excellent intermediate step. We also heard about the role culture change plays in green infrastructure. And lastly, how greater community engagement and co-design of green infrastructure projects are important. With this, I want to hand it. No, with this, I think we are about to close. I think we'll have one last slide in terms of event feedback. Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Francisco. So if there's any feedback you'd like to put in the chat, please do. And then next slide, please. So if anyone wants to stay in touch, here are our contact details. We will actually be drafting a summary document. We realize, especially during COP, there's a lot of competing events on at the same time. So we do want to keep this conversation going and this partnership going. So we will be putting some of these messages together in a synthesis document. The presentations and materials will be available on the website. And here are further on the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, of which IFRC and Zurich Insurance Company, Mexican Red Cross, and Practical Action are all members of. So there's more on their work and more on IFRC's own NBS work on that link. And very much looking forward to staying in touch and moving this work forward. So thank you also from my side to everyone, also to Nina and Sanika in the background, to all our excellent speakers who really brought a range of perspectives and voices and gave us a really rich discussion. And to my co-pilot, and I could not agree more, he does look like a pilot with his microphone and all. So let's pilot into the future and work on nature-based solutions. Thank you, everyone, and a good COP to those of you who are there.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.